this is essentially a collection of various sets of holiday snaps, and we will be looking at 3 islands in particular in the East Aegean. This one here, which isn't named on this map, unfortunately, which is the island of Lesbos.
Keep muttering on about remembering.
Then we will go up to this island here, which is Lemnos, which is quite an important staging post for migrants. There are big deltas and marshes up in this sort of area of the north coast of the Aegean. And it's a good staging post for things that would otherwise probably not make it over such a long sea journey, would have to go round. Of course, if they went round, it would take them over the Gallipoli Peninsula. And as we'll see here a little bit later, Lemnos had an important part to play in the course of the Gallipoli campaign. And then finally, we'll go down to Rhodes and have a look at some wildlife from there. So just having a little look at, first of all, at Lesbos. This is the coast that you see regularly on your TV screens and your newspapers, where various migrants come across from Turkey. It's only about 6 or 7 miles. Most of the time, it's fairly sheltered water. So it's relatively straightforward run in a small boat. We stayed on our trips up in Nithmima at the top. A lot of the wildlife is around these 2 big inland seas. Again, superb sheltered harbours. This one is also very famous for its sardines, so much so that in the autumn there is an annual sardine festival in this little town called Kaloni. The main town's down here with its airport, and this is where we stayed. We were up just on the shoulder of the hill. Nice little pedestrianised town, so it was all right where we were staying. I wouldn't have wanted to have been staying down in the middle of town, because it would have made life so much more difficult to cart a tripod and a camera and a very heavy telephoto lens around all the time. Like so many of the East Aegean islands, there is a fort which probably has classical origin somewhere, but was mostly a Crusader fort. And you see these in most of the main towns on any of the large inhabited East Aegean islands. Just down the road from there is another quite impressive small town. This one's called Petra, named after this large rock which has a church on it, and a pretty hot, as you can see from the person just on the side of the hill there, has a pretty horrible penitential road up. As in so many of these places, there's a nice collection of classical masonry and Crusader masonry in the forts, because it's always so much easier to quarry what somebody else has already quarried and cut. But as you can see, albeit it's a Crusader fort, there are a lot of things which look much more like pieces of classical relief sculpture than armour of Crusader period. And certainly the Crusaders were not into staging fights with some form of wild cat. And that's the group that's set into the wall of the fort there. Rather more modern showing that there was a much later usage of these forts, as well as essentially administrative billets when the Dodecanese were an Italian possession between the two world wars. But going on to some of the things that you see, we were there. We were in both our trips to Lesbos were in high summer, so there was a limited amount of flora around. But one of the things that was there was one of these little wild delphiniums, which seemed to be everywhere.
Ooh.
Great variety of colourful insects. Much nicer wasps to get stung by than our own. A lot of dragonflies. This is the sort of fairly typical big dragonfly of all the Aegean islands and down into Crete. This one I think is called a violet dropwing. But if somebody knows their dragonflies, I'm perfectly happy to be corrected at the end. This one I'm pretty sure is a black-tailed skimmer.
Look, it's proboscis. Look at that.
And that's what the same species looks like from above.
That's fabulous. It's very ethereal.
Oh,
look at that.
Another of the very common dragonflies of that area is this thing, which is an orange-winged dropwing. And then we have a red-veined darter. And you'll see a lot of these dragonflies are very similar to things we have in Britain, but they're not quite the same. And that really is a sort of theme that you'll see throughout this talk, not just with the dragonflies or the butterflies, but the birds as well. This, I think, is a southern darter. Again, it's very like the darters we get here. That's another red-veined darter. That's the female violet dropwing. And this thing that looks very, very like our common blue damselfly is in fact the blue feather-legged damselfly. We obviously didn't have a moth trap or a nice UV emitting light with this, but we did have the outside light on our apartment, which attracted a number of moths, including this big thing called a white-bordered hawk moth. And this is about not far short of 3 inches from end to end.
Oh, the caterpillar.
Swallowtails in Britain, down in Norfolk. And this is the same species, albeit a subtly different subspecies. They feed on fairly toxic plants, and they sequester the hydrocyanins from these, so that they are become extremely toxic and get left alone. And that's what it grows into, and that's basically like the same, like the sort of swallowtail you could see if you're lucky down in Norfolk. Slightly paler, the Norfolk ones, where this has got pale scales showing through, the Norfolk ones would have a much darker set of markings in the forewing. This one's a scarce swallowtail sitting on the passenger side wing mirror of our hired car, and I point out that the scratches on the wing mirror came with the hired car. They're not mine. Large white, again, something that does appear over here. These was another one. This is one of the blues. Blues are complicated on the continent, and they get worse the further you go into the Aegean. So we'll just leave this as one of the blues, I'm afraid. This is the Aegean meadow brown, and there are supposedly 3 separate subspecies of it, one of which is the one found only on Lesvos. So presumably this is the Lesvos subspecies of Aegean meadow brown. But I'm never terribly happy trying to rationalize backwards to identifications by dint of where I am rather than actually by being able to identify it. None of the literature that I've been able to consult has been terribly convincing on how you should tell one subspecies apart from the others. Painted lady, just like we get here. Well, certainly most years we get them in quite abundance now in Berwickshire, particularly near the coast, and hopefully before long they'll be with us again. Not many signs of annoying insects. The horseflies that we did see were small. This is about ½ an inch long, so that was quite nice not to be troubled by very much biting us. We were fairly far away from the nearest large area of fresh water, so at the end of the island we stayed at, mosquitoes weren't a problem either. A lot of grasshoppers being in the arid areas. I'm afraid as to identification of Greek grasshoppers, it's a closed book to me. There is a 3-volume print-on-demand work, but apparently it's about £1,100 for the 3 volumes, so it will remain a closed book to me. Crab spiders were surprisingly common. These are quite colourful because they tend to take the background colour. That is the same specimen as you saw in the previous photograph, and you can see it's moved, so it's changed its colour to try and blend in better with the background. It doesn't particularly work in this case, but sometimes you would see them on yellow flowers and they'd have turned bright yellow just to blend in quite nicely. Ants were everywhere. Seen here finishing stripping off the skeleton of a small reptile. Talking of reptiles, we've got there were quite a lot of terrapins, a number of small lakes beside roads held quite healthy populations. This one in particular had parking facilities beside it, and people would go and they would drop little bits of puppy food from one of the shops in the town where we were staying, sold small bags of puppy food, especially for the purpose of, this is the European striped-necked terrapin, and this one, which doesn't have the stripes but has spots, is the European pond terrapin. But as you can see, there were quite often places where you would get a number of them hauled out. Some places you would get quite large numbers of them hauled out. This was a good little bird watching lake, not terribly far from where we were living. Also, spur-thighed tortoises were around. It was quite hot in July, so they tended to keep themselves fairly well hidden. This one was having a nice cooling mud bath in a large pond which had all but dried out beside the road. A lot of young toads around, which kept the various large water birds perfectly well fed. But some of them did get the chance to grow up to be rather more attractive adults. saw a few snakes, not all that many. This was the only one that I managed to see when I wasn't driving. So this is the only one that I was able to get a picture of. But Lesvos is particularly famous in British nature circles for its birds. And every spring, large numbers of very serious bird watchers go to Lesvos in an effort to see early spring migrants and a variety of things that you can't see in Britain, like flamingos. Unfortunately, it has become very crowded with bird watchers, and it's not a place for somebody like me that likes to spend time quietly on his own trying to get photographs of birds. So hence why we were there in the summer when we didn't see many other bird watchers, but it's a much harder task to get decent photographs in harsh overhead summer sunlight. A number of the species have by then, of course, passed through to go on and breed up in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Southwest Asia, and won't be back again till the autumn. Tiny population of black storks there. These are not approachable birds. That was as close as I was ever able to get to black stork, I'm afraid. As you can see, the light's very harsh. Looks just like our herring gull when it's young, but when it grows up, its legs turn yellow because this is what for a time was called yellow-legged herring gull, but it's now regarded as a species of its own right, yellow-legged gull. Little tern, well, we've got small numbers of those breeding down the Northumberland coast. But you also get common tern there as well. Again, just like a your local duck pond, you get coot and you get moorhens. If you go down to the seaside, you can see cormorants fishing. And some of the ponds have got great herons. But they've also got this little fellow, which is a Kentish plover, which is like a sort of washed out version of our ring plover or our little ring plover. Seen here sitting on eggs. As you can see, it's a fairly indistinct little plover with without any of the black markings that you get on the small plovers that we get here. And that's a fairly well-grown youngster of the year, but they also had, this is obviously being mid-July, a second brood. So there were these absurd little long-legged fluff balls running around. This is a heroic little ring plover sitting in a nest. This was one of the hottest days we had. It was over 40 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade where this little bird was sitting, incubating a clutch of eggs, and it sat stoically. We passed it and left it in peace for a couple of hours and passed back again, and it was still there, manfully shading the eggs under it. So real dedication. That's presumably a first brood from the year, because it's a fairly fully grown young little ring plover. You can see by the beautiful emargination on all the feathers on the flank and the wings. That's it, and perhaps a better view of it. That's the adult female, or it's going to be an adult female. Again, it's just starting to get its masking across the face. it's lost some of the emargination. You can see the feathers in this part are essentially adult feathers from the first molt. Again, though, with the theme of similar to here, but here we've got a common sandpiper, which if you can't see yet on the rivers near here, you will be able to by the end of the month. But they're mixed in there with black-winged stilts. Now, black-winged stilts are noisy creatures, and they're not ideal when you're wanting to photograph things. Thankfully, though, there are some very large salt pans on Lesvos, and just beside them there is effectively there's a very shallow canal, and there's a road runs down the side of it, so you could photograph from open window of a vehicle, and by doing that, you didn't disturb the birds. The black-winged stilts didn't disturb all the other birds, so they were happy, and consequently, so was I. Again, we had these little gangling fluff balls, which were very cute. That's only a day or two old. They do look so ungainly when they're out of the water. Once they're like that and in the water, they're much more in the element that they've evolved for, and they would quite happily feed themselves with just an occasional glance back to the watchful parents. And this is one that obviously had an impressive itch, and at this stage they're almost all leg. As they grow up a bit, they become this beautifully marked black and brown scalloped feathers. This is my favourite plumage for the black-winged stilts. Unfortunately, they only really retain that plumage from when they first grow proper feathers until their first autumn, and then they molt. But as you can see, it's a really handsome bird when it's like that. Excuse me. They're perfectly happy to swim as well as to wade when they're doing their feeding. So they're just lovely birds to spend time with. They also have avocets, again, something you get quite commonly here, not quite this far north yet, unfortunately, but anybody that's birdwatched from the Humber southwards in summer will have seen these on mud flats and ponds, and they're quite abundant there. Any suitable area with a lot of shallow water will have at least one pair. Some of the bigger lakes have many pairs, and this again is a first brood young avocet. Again, sort of get a somewhat scalloped back and wing plumage when they molt from down into the proper feathers. And again, they lose that when they have their first proper molt. This one's full grown, and a couple of months later, it will look just like its parents, as will this chap. And that I think is an older one that's a fairly early molt. You can see it's got one or two quite decent white feathers, and the rest of it's looking very tatty. White storks were quite common, and unlike their black brethren, they're much more approachable. Like in Western Europe, they will nest on rooftops, like this lot on the roof of one of the small Greek Orthodox churches. And unlike the black storks, they'll happily come and feed on small areas where there's been dumping taking place. And if there are good morsels to pick up, they are completely oblivious to human disturbance. So it's a sparrow but it's not a sparrow like we know it. This is a thing called a rock sparrow, which is really an Asian sparrow, but they do get as far west as some of the islands in the Aegean. As you can see, this is a very heavy bill. It's it's evolved for feeding on large seeds, as well as the sort of omnivorous diet typical of all sparrows. Chaffinch, very similar chaffinch to ours. A lot of the birds have got slightly different plumages there. Chaffinch essentially doesn't. That's the same as the chaffinch that'll be visiting the feeder in your garden. It's a young crested lark. It doesn't have its crest, so it's first when you see it, you think, what on earth is that? And thankfully a parent comes along and feeds it, and you think, oh, it's a young crested lark. And that is one of the parents, with its crest down for peeing at. That's it, with its head up. It's like a sort of Mohican, but almost more transverse. We have turtle doves, and turtle doves are still quite common in Lesbos, unlike here where they're getting a bit too much like hen's teeth. And again, if you're in, as here, orchard or and there's any prospect of water, and this is, you can see by the dead algae, this is the edge of just a small pond, so it's down to drink. And again, this had the benefit of a little track that you could take a car down and sit in the shade of some of the trees, excuse me, and photograph birds coming in to drink. Stone chat, exactly the same as we get here. But instead of yellowhammers, they've got black-headed buntings, and these are quite spectacular birds. Unfortunately, they have in the past suffered in the same way as our goldfinches have with the cage bird trade. Blackbirds, just to remind us of home. And sombre tit. Now, sombre tit looks essentially like a young blue tit, sort of drab version of a blue tit. Even more reminds you, if you've ever been to a museum in the second half of the 20th century that still had on display a collection of stuffed animals that had first gone on display when Victoria was still on the throne. Blue tits start to look like that when once they've been fading for 70 or 80 years. Henry, for example, what was in York Castle Museum in the 1970s, will have seen blue tits looking very similar to that. Another rock sparrow. Squirrels, Asiatic or Syrian squirrels are very charismatic little things. Huge toes on their little feet. These are really unusual in the Aegean, in that only Lesbos, for some reason, has a population of these. They're a bit smaller than our squirrels, even our native red squirrel, and they tend to live in the oldest of the olive groves, the ones that are hundreds of years old, that are full of interesting holes and crevices that would be fascinating to be able to poke an endoscope in and see what's living there. This might be what stares back at you. There are 3 different nuthatches on Lesbos. This one, which is the one which has moved into northeast England and southeast Scotland in recent decades. This one, which is a thing called Western rock nuthatch, and it plasters its nests on the sides of buildings and bridge parapets, and that's it again. And the third one, which unfortunately I don't have photographs of, is a thing called Cooper's nuthatch, which is has a red bib, like almost like a robin's breast under its chin. She's one of the real charismatic birds of Lesbos. Not there in any numbers, but a thing called Rufus-tailed robin, or Rufus, now called Rufus bush-chat, but it's had more supposedly common names, certainly vernacular names in English, than just about anything else over relatively short periods. Each time the ornithological powers that be bring out a fresh English list, it seems to change its name. But these would cock their tails up in display, and wonderful long tails. This is a little bit bigger than our robin, but not very much so. Swallows, just like exactly the same as here. This was in a restaurant, and this collared dove was also in the same restaurant. And of course, we all recognize that as a jay, but then we say, wait a minute, it's got a black cap to its head. And this is the East Aegean subspecies of the jay. And all the books tell you that you'll be lucky to see these, other than as you drive along past oak woods, you might see them flit across the road. But in the town where we were staying, there was a small flock of them that didn't read the books because they flitted around the gardens. This is the handrail at the edge of the garden of the apartment we were in. And they're handsome birds, and these were very approachable. And this was our landlord's TV aerial. So this particular group would flit around the top end of the town and would visit quite regularly. And finally, for Lesbos, the real colourful attraction in the summer was the bee eaters. They were quite abundant. They were nesting in a number of places quite close to roads, so you had the opportunity of, again, working to photograph them from a car. They would stop on trees, knock the stings off the food. If they didn't someone would swallow them themselves, but others would take them, like this one, and fly into little holes in the bank, because they were rearing what, again, I take it by that time was probably a second brood of youngsters. So moving on north to Lemnos, and you say, well, why there? Well, I'd read bird reports from Lesbos, and they would speak of migration, and most of the migrants went over the short strait, the same one that the human migrants use. But a lot of others were seen disappearing off to the from the western end of the island and were going northwest. And I was wondered, where did they go to? So I got a map of the Aegean and discovered that there was this island halfway between the north of the Aegean and Lesbos. It was obvious that this would be either the destination or at the very least the staging point. particularly when I discovered that these two large inland lakes are Ramsar Convention scheduled wetlands because of the numbers of wintering flamingo and the flock of about 5,000 ruddy duck that winter there as well. So we took ourselves off there and had a fortnight staying in Mudros, and in that time, and that was at peak migration time when Lesvos was full of birdwatchers, we saw one other pair of binoculars on one occasion for about 10 minutes and had the birds to ourselves. So it was a very pleasant experience. Not a lot of English spoken, but enough that we could get by. Main town, which I'll show you some pictures of in a minute, is Barina over in the west. Again, it has its Crusader fort, and but this bay here was where the British and Common and Empire, as it then was, fleet was based before the invasion of Gallipoli. The headquarters for the Army Corps was just in this peninsula, just south of Mudros, and there was a large field hospital there. There's a very large war grave for the men who were wounded, evacuated to the field hospital, but sadly didn't make it back home afterwards. So this is again, Crusader Fort. This is in the main town in the island. As you can see, main town it might be, but it's not very big. Small harbour, but the island ferry is too big actually to fit in the harbour, so it just comes in end on to a concrete breakwater and puts down its gangplank, and cars can get on and off there. Quite what the Crusaders were doing that far north, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to have been a fort that had a terribly active role in the Crusader times, but it's still quite well preserved and gives really nice views of the town and the surrounding areas. And it has this large herd of deer. It was introduced in late 40s or early 50s. I think it started off as 3 deer. There's now about 200 of them. Not quite sure what they are. The only identification I've managed to find online suggested they were fallow deer, but that clearly is not the horns of a fallow buck. Similar pieces of repurposed Crusader masonry being used in later buildings in the area. This is the town where we stayed. We were in one of only 2 hotels in the area. This little tiny building along here, as you can see, this wasn't a commercial place. Very quiet, lovely place, comes very highly recommended. Bit of classical antiquity on the hills. As you can see, a few sheep, but otherwise no crowd at all, no tourists whatsoever. So let's have a look at some wildlife. Lots of these turban buttercups everywhere. The nice bright red version, unlike those of you that have spent some time in Crete, where a lot of them are a much paler version. These are really quite spectacular in the spring. A lot of orchids. So I think this is probably Orpheus iricolor. A lot of these bee orchids in the Eastern Mediterranean have had a variety of treatments in the last 20, 25 years by some Belgian botanists and by some German botanists, and they all agree that there are lots of species, but they don't agree very much beyond that, I'm afraid. So the taxonomy is a mess. This is definitely from, if you buy a 40-year-old book on European orchids, this is yellow Ophrys lutea, and it's nice and simple. Unfortunately, there are now about 30 species that have been hived off, so we'll just leave this as one of the Ophrys lutea group. This one is fairly distinctive and is almost certainly Ophrys frigani, as is that. This top petal drooping over the lip, top sepal drooping over the lip, is quite distinctive for this one. This is always been one of my favourite orchids, Orchis papilionaceae, butterfly orchid. Beautiful thing. You get a variety of these, from almost the whole petal being this palest pink, to being almost covered in the dark markings, and everything in the range in between. Again, there have been attempts by some workers to try and split off these, but if you look at 2 or 3, you might think, oh, I can put these into different subspecies. If you look at 200 or 300, you realize that there's a complete continuum, and it's absurd to try and split them down into anything else. This little labiate was quite common everywhere, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. But I see Michael lurking in the background, so no doubt somebody will be able to put me right later. Not so many reptiles there, but we did, possibly partly because we were there in spring, and that was at the north end of the Aegean, and it wasn't particularly warm, but we did see a spur-thighed tortoise. As far as I know, this is one of the same chafers that we get in Britain, and certainly seen something very similar in France. Tiger beetle, not the same species as any of the ones we get here, but looks very similar to our commonest tiger beetle. When we move on to the birds, black-tailed godwit in a pretty horrible picture, but it's the best I was able to do given the direction of the light, I'm afraid. Rough with a very muddy bill, but again, just things that you can see moving through Britain at the moment. They have a red shank in summer plumage. Whether they actually stay there to breed or not, I'm not certain. Quite a lot of the flamingos move out up into the deltas and lakes in the mainland, just north of the Aegean, but a good several hundred remain, largely, I think, probably not going to breed on the island. So probably relatively young birds that stay in the summer. Most of the ruddy shelduck, by the time we were there, had already gone north, but there were still a few around. This is a pair of them flying over the lake where they winter. Spotted redshank, beautiful bird. You can see just the characteristic little downturn at the bottom of the bill is the way to help you to identify it. It's the same bird. More ruffs and marsh sandpiper. If this appeared in the south of England, it would have a crowd of men with big long lenses around it. There, you got it to yourself. We had black-winged stilts there. No doubt they would be setting up territory and were preparing to breed. There's a thing called green sandpiper. We had a few of these through Britain, in particularly in the autumn, not so many in the spring, but again, it just goes with the theme of being quite similar really to what you've got in Britain. Wood sandpiper doesn't come here to Britain in great numbers, but you do get a few of them. This lovely dark and pale checkered markings on the back. Rough. Quite common. They tended to be probably the commonest wader on the marshes roundabout. Gargany, I also think these are probably the most handsome of the birds we get in Europe. Summer visitor, unlike most of our ducks, which are either remain with us in Europe or come down from the high Arctic to visit us in the winter. These are obviously a bit more delicate, so they go down to Africa for the winter and pass on through the Mediterranean and then spread around quite a lot of Central and Northern Europe. This is a thing called a calandra lark. That's an incredibly heavy bill that they have. These are mainly feeders on small animals, but they can also turn that bill to breaking pretty hard, tough seeds. Wood shrike was the common shrike there. The handsome bird, very inquisitive, intelligent birds. They would quite happily look at us as well as us looking at them. Just like here, collared doves. In fact, most of you will be aware collared doves are relatively recent colonists in Britain. They gradually made their way across, and the first ones were bred in England in the early 50s. Obviously, this being the far side of Europe, they made it rather earlier to the far side of Europe. So they've been in the Aegean, I think, for about 100 years. This is, to my mind, the most spectacular of the subspecies of yellow wagtail. Now we get yellow wagtails breeding here, the pure yellow form. This is the black-headed one, Montacilla flava feldegii, and it's a really smart-looking bird. And on a lot of the East Aegean islands, if you're there around about now, in fact, you can see quite a variety of different subspecies of wagtail going through in large flocks. Similarly, if you're in southern Italy at this time of year, you can see huge flocks of these 1,500, 2,000 birds sometimes, 5, 6 different subspecies. Very, very impressive and very noisy to see and hear. But you also get white wagtail in the same way as this is a subspecies that's found over most of continental Europe. I mean, our subspecies, our pied wagtail, is slightly different, but a number of these pass through the Berwickshire and East Lothian coast each year. Kingfishers, they are just the same as here. but they also have little crakes, and little crake does occasionally breed in penny numbers in Britain, but they're very, very difficult to see. But again, thankfully, this was right beside a road. It was too low to the ground to be able to photograph from the car, but I was able to get out of the side of the car further away from the water and crawl along the road and use the car to hide me. And so this was taken lying in the road, and they're attractive little birds. These are about the size of a sparrow. So think of a sparrow-sized moorhen, and you've got roughly the sort of bird. This was one that was taken from the car window, as was that. As was that. You can see the going back. That's the male and the female. Sedge warblers, which again, I haven't heard one yet. I don't know if anybody else has locally, but they'll be with us within the next week or two, if they're not here already. Like again, the few bits of wetland that are there hold coot, just like here. The rocky outcrop at that time of year seemed to have a wheat ear on it. Some would stay to breed there, but the vast majority of them would be moving through from sub-Saharan Africa, where it spent the winter, stop off for a day or two to refuel, and then they'll move on up into, well, these ones would be in eastern mainland Europe. They have purple heron. Now, okay, purple heron does breed in Britain. There's at least one, if not two pairs down in Kent now. But this is not something you would see very often in Britain. But here we've got grey heron, which we do see here as an everyday bird, sharing this little bit of marshland with a purple heron. And further across the same marsh was this group of 4 night heron. Night heron breeds quite commonly in northern France and Belgium, so we're not very far away from us. Doesn't breed in Britain now that the escapees from Edinburgh Zoo all seem to have died off. For a time there were feral birds in central Scotland which did attempt to breed, which had come from Edinburgh Zoo in the 70s, and the population kept on to about the late 90s, possibly just into the 2000s before it died out. Great egret, again, a bird which is becoming an increasingly common passage and wintering bird in Britain, was a reasonably common across there. Didn't see many little egrets there, which is perhaps a surprise at that time of year. But these great egrets were, this one was in the harbour in the town we were staying in. Eastern Benelli's warblers were around, beautiful songsters, quite charismatic little warbler. We're also, we were lucky enough just a couple of miles from where we were staying to have some marsh, and this is a female marsh harrier which we saw coming in, and it was obviously really tired because it had obviously, we'd been in the marsh the day before and there were no marsh harriers around, so this had obviously just newly migrated in. As soon as it put down, it started to be mobbed by this pack of hooded crows. Now, the hooded crow is the same hooded crow as we get in the Highlands, except the further south in Eastern Europe you go, the paler the grey in the hooded crows. And it became apparent that this poor marsh harrier was getting quite a beating from these crows. So I took the decision that, first of all, you approach it and you get the nice close-up shots of it. These wonderful piercing eyes, which he uses to hunt small birds and mammals around marshes. But I decided that rather than leave it to its fate, too many harriers from Scotland and England get predated by our shooting estates. So I decided I would at least see if I could save this. So the zoom lens came off the camera and went in one pocket. The camera body went off the other pocket, and this was picked up and taken back to the car. And this is a photograph, obviously not taken by me. This was taken by my wife of this somewhat wet marsh harrier, who's asking me, "What are you going to do with it?" Well, a plan sort of came about. We emptied the boot of the car out and we put this in. It sat perfectly quietly. It didn't have the energy to do anything else. We had passed a pile of clean-looking cardboard boxes sitting beside some bins half a mile down the road. So we picked one of those up on the way back to the hotel. We also had seen a roadkill but very fresh chicken slightly further down the road. So it was or at least a bit of it was acquired as well, popped in the box, and the bird was put in and it was taken into the hotel, put in the wardrobe overnight, and thought in the morning, well, it'll either be dead or it'll have recovered. And thankfully, we picked the box up and you could hear a little bit of movement inside. So took it out onto the balcony, laid it on the table, opened the lid, and out flew one perfectly healthy marsh harrier, flew twice around the little square outside the hotel, much to the astonishment of a man walking past, and then flew off in the direction of the marsh. So it seems to have survived. Again, similar birds to what we would have at home. We've got common tern there, we've got sandwich tern, black-necked grebe, and little owl. Now, this is part of the one of the gun enclosures where the artillery had dug in to protect the fleet when it was at anchor off Mudros. And little owl, again, is a bird that you get reasonably commonly in Northumberland. We get them in the borders as well, but not many. We had only had one confirmed breeder, albeit it bred several years during the recent BTO Atlas project. So finally, let's move south and spend a little time in the island of Rhodes. And Rhodes town, again, has its Crusader castle. Lindos has what started off as the temple of Lindian Athena in classical times, probably 2,500 years ago. It was later upgraded to Crusader castle status. This part of the island is quite hilly, quite large, quite high, reasonably high mountains here. This part is much less hilly and has an arable agriculture over quite a lot of it. So that is, this is the temple of Lindian Athena, and it has its Crusader expansion, and these crenulations, I think, were Venetian additions thereafter. So it's had a history of use for at least 2,500 years. You get a very good view from it. This is looking south from it. This little enclosed area is at St. Paul's Bay. So it's one of the, this is a place where St. Paul was shipwrecked on his journey to preach Christianity in Europe. These cliffs along the background are riddled with caves, and indeed these caves were used for quite a lot of the filming of the movie of The Guns of Navarone back in the 1960s. Donkeys are available for hire to take overweight German tourists up to the Lindian Acropolis. More civilized people walk. Interesting, we have twice been in Lindos on what was essentially the first night of the holiday season. So because the cash crop of the tourists hadn't been around, invites were put out to come down to the village square. There was dancing for laid on. There were free Easter eggs for all the children, and boiled eggs for the painted boiled eggs for the adults. A lot of limestone. This is just a small gastropod shell fossil, not a hugely old set of rocks, 30, 40 million years old, a lot of limestones. As a result, though, it's a very fertile island. This is a freshwater crab you find in a number of the Aegean islands, and it's also quite common in some parts of Crete. It breeds in streams, so never sees the sea. Rhodes, of all the places I've been to, probably has the most spectacular set of crickets. This was the hotel the last hotel we stayed in Lindos had quite a lot of scrubland beside it, and this was perched on top of glass at the outdoor restaurant. A number of these really attractive big crickets would be hopping around beside you while you were having your evening meal, and then they would go to bed, and these would start to come out. There were two different kinds of mantises. They were quite common. There was like the one I just showed, which was slightly bigger, and this one's smaller. These wonderful fern-like antennae. When you think that these things use their antennae to smell, if you've got scent receptors on the end of each of these little bits of the antennae, they must have the most amazing three-dimensional smell scent map of the world round about them. We can't really be, as humans with a fairly pure sense of smell, we can't really begin to imagine what that sort of 3D scent world must be like. This is up in Pinewood on Timaeus Stavros, which is the highest, or one of the two highest mountains on the island. And this is a caddisfly, but it's a terrestrial caddisfly. Excuse me, it doesn't spend its larval stages in the water, unlike all but one of the British caddisflies. It spends them out crawling around in the undergrowth. And this was about 2 centimeters long. The one British caddisfly that it shares its lifestyle with lives down in the Wye Forest and Forest of Dean, and it's about 3 or 4 millimeters long. This was quite an impressive little creature. The only time I've ever seen terrestrial caddisflies. This is the Mediterranean tarantula, a fair-sized spider, body about the size of a 50p piece. They are toxic, so don't mess with them. Not terribly toxic, but again, some people do suffer an anaphylactic reaction to them. As you can see, there are other quite large spiders there. This is a swallowtail butterfly. And, there are the largest butterfly that we have in Britain. Indeed, they're pretty much the largest we've got in Europe. And as you can see, spider can still quite happily deal with it. This, I think, is, if you bear with me, because I think I have an identification for this. It's, I think this is the Aegean subspecies of the green hair streak. Indeed, these are. You can see that the actual hairline is just reduced to just the odd little dot rather than the full line. This is an eastern festoon. It's related to the swallowtails. Spectacular butterfly, similar size to a swallowtail. This is a thing called the, as far as I can work out, an anomalous blue. It's had a good peck to both hind wings, and it's rather worn, so it's not easy to be sure. And butterfly identification is not my first love, I'm afraid. You can also find these if you turn over enough stones. These grow to about 3 inches, 75 millimeters. Again, apparently very painful if you get stung by one, but they're not particularly toxic beyond a bit of pain. Again, unless you have an anaphylactic reaction. A couple of days later, you'll be right as rain again. This is a big agamid lizard, commonly known as the Rhodian dragon, and these grow up to about 45 centimeters, 80 inches long, and they've got a bit of an attitude, but these are just quite young ones. One of the wall lizards. This is on the town walls in excuse me, in Rhodes town itself, and as you can see, it's just undergoing a mold with little frilly bits here. This was the only snake that we saw on the Isle of Rhodes. Unfortunately, this was a dead one lying on the road right at the very south end of the island. Still a lot of fishing done, small boats sold around the local tavernas. This was outside one of the rural tavernas, a line of octopus drying in the sun. A lot of really attractive flowery meadows, good variety of areas which clearly didn't get a lot of herbicides. So you had, as you can see here, lovely colourful drifts of a mixture of poppies and this two-coloured variety of the chrysanthemum. Actually, now we've now moved into another genus, but at that time they were Chrysanthemum coronarium. Rhodes is famous for its orchids, and this is Ophrys candica, which it shares with the island of Crete. This is again going back to what I was saying earlier about these yellow and black orchids. This would just have been yellow Ophrys for 40 years ago. This is now Ophrys sicula. Umbilicata. Of course, most of you will probably know these are pollinated by bees which come along. This looks like a bee. They produce pheromones from inside the stigmatic cavity down here, which smell like a female bee. The male's head, when it attempts to mate with this, comes up against these two pollinia, and these two little balls of pollen get stuck on the top of the bee's head. It goes to another plant and they get brushed off, and it can pollinate the bee, the orchid. This is one of the more spectacular locally Aegean orchids called Ophrys reinholdii, Reinhold's orchid, and that's it from the front. This is Mussolini's summer home. As I said earlier, the Dodecanese were owned or administered by Italy between the wars. Mussolini had this large villa built on the slopes of one of the two high mountains, and this is a very popular place for orchid lovers to go. You can follow this path up onto the hill beside it, and there are a good variety of orchids, some of which you don't see anywhere else on the island. Again, back to butterfly orchid. Before, this was in the gardens surrounding Mussolini's old house. That's Orchis sancta, because these this bit at the top of the flower reminds people of old-fashioned monks' cowls. This is one of these, which one of the Andrena species of bees, which has was a particular correlation between a lot of these individual species of bee and a lot of the individual orchids. And a rest harrow, there's quite a variety of different rest harrows there. If you can get to, obviously not this year, but if you can get to places like Rhodes from end of March to mid to late May, it's very colourful. Vast majority of the flowers are all flower in a period of 6 or 8 weeks, and then everything browns off as the summer comes upon them. This is a real rarity. This is a thing called Rhodian fritillary. And there are only a handful of sites, and this was one of the better known sites where there were about a dozen specimens of it. That's also supposedly one of the sites where it's most abundant. So this is a real rarity. Attractive little flower, something like 2 centimeters from top to bottom, so a bit smaller than the snake's head fritillary that we're used to seeing here. Again, Rhodes town itself has quite spectacular Crusader castle walls, which, as you can see, have had these amazing battlements added to the top. They also, as you can see, with the fresh masonry down what has been a crack, they do tell the story that this is on an earthquake zone. It's beside Turkey, and when we were first in Rhodes back in the early 90s, there was still a reasonable sized Turkish population in Rhodes town. The mosque was quite active. They have largely left now. There have been 1 or 2 terrorist attacks in Rhodes town on the Turkish community, and sadly that element of colour is no longer there. This is at the northeastern end of the town. These 3 windmills are at the edge of the harbour, and this is reputed to be where the Colossus of Rhodes stood. A show, not wildlife flying, but a jet. On one of our trips to Rhodes, this was undoubtedly the rarest of the flying objects we could see, because courtesy of One Icelandic Volcano, we had an extra week on Rhodes. this you can see is an Aegean Airlines jet, so it was a domestic flight from Athens, and that was there were a couple of these each day, and for a while these were the only jets that we would see. Turning to a few birds just to finish off with, this is a swallow having a drink in the hotel pool, and nearby gathering some mud for its nest. I showed you the crows, the hooded crows before when we were attacking the marsh harrier. As you can see here, they are much paler than the ones we have in the Highlands here, but otherwise they're identical. This was also in the hotel grounds. This is a thing called a blue rock thrush, a beautiful songster, and quite an impressively bright coloured bird too. Another harrier, this time it's something called Montague's harrier. They do breed in tiny numbers in England, but they're much commoner further east in Europe, and they pass through roads. They don't actually stay and breed there, but they are beautiful birds, real masters of the slightest little bit of current in the air. This is a bird that we used to have breeding locally in huge numbers, which has gradually decreased in mainland Britain. It's now extinct in southeast Scotland. This is a corn bunting. Horrible rasping sound. If you're in the area where there are corn buntings in spring, you don't need to look very hard if you're surveying for them if they're there. If you don't hear them, they're definitely not there. Again, the common shrike there was woodchat shrike. There's a pair, beautiful birds. As well as house sparrow, we had flocks of Spanish sparrow. These tend to like slightly dampish areas on the edge of agricultural areas and go around in flocks of usually 20 to 100 birds. And there's a group of mostly female Spanish sparrows. This is another crested lark. We saw some from Lesbos. This is another better picture of it. The most amazing hind toes. Unlike our skylarks, our skylark's crest would probably stop off about there, but very similar looking. This is a roller. Didn't see many of them. Unfortunately, the only place we ever did manage to see them was on power and telegraph lines. So sadly, not very nice pictures. Greenfinch. Again, it's the same greenfinch we get here, except that's the colour it actually was. This is another of these birds which, like the hooded crow, the further south and east you go in Europe, brighter they get. At the start of the migration season, every bush has its own Sardinian warbler there. They pour through the islands in phenomenal numbers. Smaller numbers stay to breed, but if you're there in the first week in April, every 10 yards there's another Sardinian warbler. Another bird that we get here, albeit not in huge numbers, is whinchat. They've got kestrels, but most of them are this, which is the lesser kestrel, and there is a colony of these on the seaward side of the Lindian Acropolis. Like we saw further north, night heron. This is a juvenile. and it's in a small grove of trees above a mouth of a river. This was a nice little river mouth for photographing waders. It had a road beside it. This was actually in a small town. There's not much marshland on roads. So before one of our trips, I sat with Google Earth and zoomed in as much as possible and panned around the coast and compiled a list of all the little bits of wetland. And this was one of them. And it very much rewarded me for the effort of having found where it might be. This is a marsh sandpiper. Beautiful. These are really attractive birds. They're quite large sandpipers. They're almost godwit size, but much more graceful. So at the other end of the sand of the wader scale, this is a little stint, again, a bird that we get quite commonly through British coastal waters particularly in the autumn. And this is another wood sandpiper, still in the same tiny little area of a marsh. And this one was possible to get really quite close to. It spent almost all its time standing on one leg with just toe of the other foot on sticking out. Hoopoes were around, again, probably more than would be staying to breed. This is one of the characteristic display pose with the black and white wings spread out and that amazing crest. And this is the shot that all photographers that know their hoopoo behavior try to capture, because when they find a caterpillar or other insect, they throw it up in the air and then catch it, and that's what it's doing here. And again, we found another little marsh, probably about 10 feet by 15 feet tight, which I was able to approach and lie down, and the only thing that were on it was a family of little crakes, and I was able to get very close to these. At times I had to stop photographing them because they came too close to focus. And thank you for your patience.